This is Khalid Malik's Morning Jam on FM91. Welcome to Green Hour as we shed light on all things green. One of the things that comes to mind since we started doing Green Hour on the back of COP26 here on the show is the question, are we doing enough? Are we creating enough awareness? Is there enough awareness around climate change? Is enough being done by us as individuals? Is enough being done by the government? Is the media doing enough? Or are they lagging behind, etc.? There's a whole host of questions. To talk about this and much, much more, joining us, very special guest, delighted to have you here on the show on Green Hour. Huma Yusuf is a risk consultant working across the fields of political risk analysis and forecasting, business integrity and compliance. Wait for it. She's a Harvard and MIT graduate and an award-winning journalist and columnist and media and policy researcher with a career in journalism spanning over 22 years. Recently, she's been emphasizing the need to improve the way the climate crisis is being broadcasted to the world, especially in Pakistan. To do this, she started Pakistan's first podcast on climate change called Climate Mahaul. Joining us this morning is Huma Yusuf. Wow, and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Very excited to be here and so happy that you have a green hour.
Yeah, right? I mean, I guess we'll get to that. Are we doing enough? And there's that question in the back of our heads, are we doing enough? And, are people tuning in, etc., etc. But we'll talk about that. I wanted to start off with one of your episodes on your podcast, Climate Mahaul. And we'll talk about that too. In one of your episodes, you start off by saying, by mentioning the president of COP, Alok Sharma. And you said that if that prognosis was given to us as human beings, we'd rush straight to the hospital and want a full recovery. But because it's for the planet, we're like, nah, it's all right, we're okay. But with the current political situation, globally, now here in Pakistan, it's more a case of not me, but more a case of, wait, what planet? Is this a Pakistani thing, or is this like a global populist attitude where, if it's dying, we'll take care of it when we can?
So 2 weeks ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a UN body that tries to track and explain the impacts of climate change on the world and on humanity, released a report that essentially said it's now or never. And when they meant now, they meant now, immediately, next year or two, not next 20 years, not next 50 years, not 2100, but tomorrow. And in the midst of Pakistan's political crisis, in the midst of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, in the midst of elections in France and states of emergency in Sri Lanka, that story was not picked up anywhere. There's a couple of media NGOs that looked at sort of how frequently that report was picked up by the media, put on front pages. And it was essentially this buried 2-paragraph item that showed up in newspapers and websites, right at the bottom, 2 column inches, page 7. And that was stunning to me because that is the only story that matters. Politics doesn't matter. Conflict doesn't matter. If we don't have a planet, if we can't feed ourselves and if we can't drink water, and if it's too hot for us to survive, for our bodily functions to work, then what's the point of anything else? Yeah. So I think that's a good way to understand how we're just telling this story wrong.
You mentioned in one of your articles that the window is closing in fast. It's brief and it's fast. And we keep hearing this too, right? And we keep saying this too, that it's now, and that we don't have much time. Can you put a time to that? Like, what is that brief window?
That brief window probably closed. And
closed.
And I think human beings don't really have the ability to deal with that much reality. And so I think even these reports that come out are still trying to keep offering us smaller windows, but they narrow. So there was a time, this conversation has been happening for 70 years. Right. And 70 years ago, we thought it was a 100-year window. Now we pretend that it's a 30-year window. But the honest truth is that we're down to about 5 to 8 years. And if we do not do drastic changes in just the way the entire world works, the way that we run, the way we shop, the way we get fuel, how we travel, where our food comes from, what our supply chains look like, the climate change impact will be irreversible. And I think one of the problems is that even as I say these words, we're falling into that language of jargon, the climate change language, which feels catastrophizing. Yes, exactly. Yeah. It feels catastrophizing and it feels jargony. And I think that's where people switch off and they think, you're talking about an apocalypse that people have been complaining about for many years. It hasn't really come. I was feeling very hot during the heat wave last year, but oh well, I have an air conditioner.
Right.
And I think that's where everyone is failing. We're not being able to tell this story in a way that people are really hearing it.
And we want to talk about how we should be maybe telling the story. The Green Hour for me really started off the back of COP26, and I just want to sort of maybe briefly touch on what happened at COP, the 26th edition of COP. I'm going to ask you the same question you asked one of your guests on the podcast. Do you want to reflect on COP26?
Well, COP26 is also when we launched Climate Mahaul. And by we, I mean Tabad Lab, which is an Islamabad-based think tank which helps produce the show and are sort of the driving force in many ways as well, because they're planning to do a lot of policy work around this topic over coming years as well. Right. And I think we were having this conversation. I was talking to the founder of Tabad Lab, Musharraf Zaidi, and we said, we need to find a way to talk about this. This is a whole topic of conversation that we're missing in Pakistan. It's happening. It's happening in certain civil society organizations. It's happening amongst lawyers, environmental lawyers. There are environmental activists who do a lot of good work. But somehow it's not a mainstream conversation. It's not in drawing rooms. It's not on Twitter. It's not on Instagram. It's not on the nightly news. So how do we help make that happen? And I think what COP26 did was, because it was hosted by the UK, because it came on the back of a lot of visible and experiential climate change. America was on fire the summer before COP26 took place. The UK and much of Europe flooded. There were heat waves in Pakistan. There were floods across South Asia. Wherever you looked, you could finally see it and feel it. And people were losing their lives and they were losing their livelihoods. And so when COP26 hit, I do think that there had been enough emotional energy put into the experience of climate change. We'd seen rich Californians running from wildfires, and we realized, this isn't just poor Bangladeshis who are going to be affected. This is a global issue. And so I think the best thing about COP26 was it had that media buzz around it. It got onto those headline newspapers. You had that sense that this is the moment something exciting is going to happen. But I think the disappointing part of COP26 is that something very exciting did not happen, or we missed an opportunity. Progress was again slow and, not enough, insufficient, and the biggest one being the sort of pullback on the decision to really come up with a plan to phase out, like completely stop using fossil fuels. And can I
add again to that sentence?
Again.
Right?
26 iterations later, again, yes.
I mean, so doesn't that disappoint you? Doesn't that say, well, what's the point of this then? Maybe we need something else.
I think that's where the desire to launch a podcast came from, and that's where my excitement to see that you're doing Green Hour came from, because this is only going to be on the top of the agenda when every single person on the street feels that it needs to be on top of the agenda. And they're not going to feel that way unless we help them realize that they need to.
Yeah. Where do we begin? Yes, we can do Green Hour. Yes, we can do Climate Mahaul to start sort of have the conversation and then sustain the conversation, keep the conversation going. But I mean, so there's tiers of awareness, right? Does that make sense to you?
Yes. I think so. There was a fascinating UNDP report that came out a couple of 2 years ago. So it's the United Nations Development Program, and they looked at climate awareness amongst youth in Pakistan.
Right.
And if you look at the statistics in that, they're very encouraging. They imply that there's sort of over 70% climate change awareness, and they sort of spread this out amongst rural and urban areas, and consistently, across the different types of questions that they asked about awareness around what climate change is there climate change regulation, etc. There was at least a 40-50% awareness across most categories. categories. And so in that sense, you'd think this is encouraging. We all know, are aware. But if you look deeper into what that report considers climate change awareness, they're essentially talking about the experiential aspect of it. So what it's trying to get at is the fact that people are starting to recognize that it's a bit hotter, that the floods were a bit more intense. And I think that what's not happening, the kinds of awareness that we are missing, is being able to connect that with sort of other aspects of our lives. So we are not recognizing that a bigger flood means that food will be more expensive, or that, we won't be able to run a particular kind of business 5 years from now, or that we won't have enough drinking water, or that cricket as a sport is going to be threatened because there's going to be no water for the fields. It's that thing of personalizing it and making it relevant to other aspects of our lives, which I don't think we do, and I don't think that we're being helped to do by the media, by the way reporting works, etc. If you look at other polls, right, so there's this high level of climate awareness. People know the weather is changing. They see it in their daily lives. Awareness is particularly high in our rural communities. So there was a study in 2020 which found that, more than 70% of Pakistani farmers know that climate change is happening, and they can articulate what that will mean for them, their fields, their crops, etc. So there is this kind of awareness, but it's not being linked to the so what is missing. And so then if you look at other polls, so Gallup in 2019 asked people what are the top problems facing Pakistan, and it was inflation, unemployment, corruption, Kashmir, the Indian occupation of Kashmir. And then 4% of people said water crisis. And you can guess that those 4% were probably from the sort of agricultural heartlands of our country. Just in January this year, there was another poll done by Pulse consultants who again asked everyone, so what are the top problems facing our country? And the answers were inflation, unemployment, corruption. And what you see is these are the narratives coming out of our main political discourse as well, right? But the fact that we can't link something like inflation to climate change, the fact that we aren't saying, actually the fact that we are basically living in one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, which literally means that we're going to struggle to have food and water in another 5 to 10 years. It's already happening, but everyone is going to feel it in a decade or so. That's missing. I mean,
I want to talk about that too, but we talk about awareness, and the Pakistani attitude is, देखी जाएगी ना, अभी तो सही है, देखी जाएगी. But ये जो देखी जाएगी वाली attitude है, I feel like if that, the argument that I'm trying to put forth is that therefore it needs to come from a federal government policy level and down into the population. Because the population is in a place where they're worried about inflation and the price of ration and so on and so forth. So then the responsibility then lies on the government?
Well, I will play devil's advocate there. 2 decades of following politics tells me the government is not going to pick up a difficult issue. They're not going to pick up something where they need to educate the populace, explain to them why they need more taxpayer money, why they need to make things more expensive, why they need to increase oil prices, why all of us need to be happy to live in a world where we don't have electricity for several hours of the day because we've switched to renewable energy sources which are intermittent, right? These are all difficult changes, and no government is going to bring those about. You don't win an election by saying that we're going to save the planet and I'm going to stop oil and you can't use your car and please go buy a bicycle and good luck to you, right? But I believe it has to come the other way. We need citizens concerned, pushing and asking for those changes. It has to be bottom up. And I think that's why the role of the media, the role of Greena, the role of Climate Mahaul is really important, because we need people to understand that this is their lives, their livelihoods, their children's future. And we need to be asking for more, and we need to ask for it in a way that emboldens politicians to make the big changes that they need to make.
Okay, so if it has to come bottom up, then my next question, well, who's listening to me? Number one. Number two, then It's funny. I just want to blame somebody today. So, but the corporations, they need to step in and go. Listen. Well, we can hear you. We can hear you speak. We can hear you loud and clear. As a corporate entity, maybe we have the means to make some of this happen.
So all our corporations, especially sort of large international, multinational corporations, are the ones that are catering to a more aware urban middle class youth, are doing a little bit of sustainability work, right? So the good intention is there, but I think it's increasingly becoming more of a marketing effort. They realize that something is needed, but no one is willing to sort of bring up that elephant in the room, which is that the basic function of corporates in many cases is to have an environmental impact, to deliver and produce goods that we may or may not actually need. Right? And I think that if they ask too many questions or they push far enough, most corporates would probably end up in an existential crisis in sort of really thinking about, is our supply chain sustainable? You know, do our consumers really need the goods that we're trying to sell them, or could they make do with something that's more basic and more friendly to the environment? And I think when you start asking those really difficult questions, that's when boardrooms shut down. So even those sustainability efforts are just to the extent, that is feasible within their market strategies or investment strategies or whatever it is. And that's not enough is the problem.
But the jargon that we use, we touched at the beginning, life support and the time is now. So we need to change that, don't we?
We do, and I think there are some interesting efforts underway to tell this climate story differently. So I don't know if you saw that Leonardo DiCaprio film, Don't Look Up.
Oh, yeah.
In which an asteroid is coming to hit planet Earth.
Oh, yeah, I saw it.
No one believes it, even though they can see it in the sky and it's coming to hit. And that's essentially a metaphor for climate change, right? That's DiCaprio, who's a big environmental activist in his own right, trying to use the might of Hollywood to have, to tell this global story that you cannot ignore this any longer. It's literally an asteroid coming to hit planet Earth, obliterate all of us. And what has followed from that film is essentially this long debate about, is that really the metaphor? And DiCaprio keeps coming out and saying, I'm talking about climate change. This film was to try and make you understand. And if this doesn't do it, I don't know what will. And you see people like novelists like Amitav Ghosh, who is one of my favorite writers in the world, who is trying to tell the story through these beautiful 500-page novels that essentially involve the personal experience of climate change. It's in the back of every story he tells, and it'll be the story of people who are displaced because their communities are no longer, livable because of flooding or drought or something like that. He'll tell stories about the sort of long tail of colonialism and how it's changed the way our societies work in a way that all we do is extract from the earth and not give enough back. And so people are trying to find different ways to tell the story. The problem is that we're still not doing it in a way that resonates with what in Pakistan we always refer to as the awam. And I think one of the problems is that it's not a good news story at the moment. So I do think one of the tricks that we're missing is being able to, in a sensible and proportionate way, sort of talk about the apocalypse that's here or impending, but to also say that there are ways out. And I think you're starting to see that shift towards, look, there is mitigation options. There are technologies out there that we need to develop that could help us along this journey. I think for too long that has been set up as it hasn't been specific enough. So you'll sort of have this, it's more like aspirational, or it's like a dream that, look, don't worry about fossil fuel emissions, because in 2035 some genius is going to develop some, mass scale carbon capture technology and we'll all be saved overnight. It'll be fine. It'll be like the iPod of, the next 2 decades. And that's a fantasy. But what you're starting to see is sort of more and more news reporting and academic work around things that exist today that are starting to take a few steps towards that kind of fantasy world. So there is carbon capture technology. It's big, it's clunky, it's too slow, but yes, it exists. And I think the story that we need to tell is one that has this level of hope in it. That, look, this will get better. We will probably find some way to make planet Earth livable, if not ideal for most of its species, including humans, hopefully. But we are not moving fast enough. We are not prioritizing this enough. And the only way to tell a good news story is if everyone makes this the top of their news agenda and the top of the way that they think about how they live their lives.
You know, with the current political situation around the world, especially with what's happening in Ukraine, obviously we have our own climate here. How is that? I mean, clearly it's distracted from the conversation around climate change. As you said at the outset, the reports that have come in is just like some story, somewhere hidden under a whole heap of stories related to what's happening politically, the crisis globally. How has that affected climate change, or how could that affect our climate, what we see in the world today, the crises, the political crisis that we see today?
Well, it's just knocked climate out of the agenda. So if you remember, there was COP26, there was some excitement. There was the pandemic and those clear blue skies across the world when the whole, Earth had come to a bit of a shutdown for a moment. You had those beautiful stories of dolphins returning to the Bay of Venice and the whole world saying, oh, this is beautiful, how lovely. I wish it was like this all the time. And there was this little moment in the early stages of the pandemic where there was a fantasy that if we can do this for a pandemic, why can't we do this in a slightly more measured, sustainable way for the environment? So for example, instead of banning air travel, we could tax it so heavily that people only do it when they really need to, for example. Or if we can sort of, shut down offices and cruise ships, that why can't we sort of like have another look at, supply chains? Like, do you really need to be eating an avocado that came here from Brazil? Like, why can't you eat our local, chiku instead? So I think that there was this brief moment of fantasy that actually we're all living it, we're doing it, it's not perfect, this is not fun. A pandemic is a scary thing, whereas saving planet Earth would be an empowering and positive thing. But it's gone, right? The minute we sort of got back into the routine of life, the minute sort of election cycles kicked up again, the minute conflicts were able to be waged again, it's back at the bottom of the agenda. Right. And I think the big struggle, I think your challenge on Green Hour, my challenge on Climate Mahaul, every reporter's challenge out there is, how do you bring out the climate perspective of everything that we're talking about so that people realize there is no story other than this story?
Climate Mahaul is 6 episodes down.
Yes.
Where can people listen to Climate Mahaul?
Everywhere. It's on iTunes, it's on Apple, Google, SoundCloud. Just not on Spotify yet, but we're working on that.
But do listen to it. It is. I love the podcast. I have heard a couple of the episodes of from Climate Mahaul. You said Pakistan is a climate vulnerable. Is that the word, the term you use? It's a vulnerable country.
More jargon,
right?
but that's
more
the way,
jargon,
that's
which
the way
means that we're really in a lot of trouble because whilst we may not be putting out so much, we're kind of like sitting ducks.
Yes, we are sitting ducks. I think currently are ranked as the 8th most vulnerable to climate change in the world. We've been slipping up and down the top 10 ranking. Sometimes we're at 5, sometimes we're at 7. But we're in the top 10 and we're here to stay. And frankly, most of South Asia
We're here to stay.
We are here to stay, yes. And I think it's because of where we're sandwiched, right? Yeah. So we've got, a lot of it is linked to the sort of melting glaciers of the Himalayas, which are going to affect everything from rainfall to too much water to too little water along the way. But then we also get drought and heat waves because of sort of lots of complicated things about how the winds blow and pressure builds. Yeah. So it's essentially you're looking at a country that we're already what you call water scarce, but we're going to literally be out of water in another 15 to 20 years. And I think when I say something like that, I'm saying those words and even I can't imagine what that really means. And sort of, the idea that drinking water would be a luxury good, the fact that you would have a black market for any water source, right, potable or not, is a terrifying prospect. And when if you look around sort of how our cities are developing, we're just heading towards large tree-lined boulevards that suck water. People want golf courses. People want swimming pools. I mean, the reality of what our environment can sustain and what we think we want and we are trying to do is just completely disconnected.
I want to go back to climate, Mahaul, because you also just mentioned COVID-19 and the pandemic and how the world was beautiful for that period. Very interesting. In one of your, again, in the same particular episode with your guest, and I must mention his name.
Adil Najm.
Professor Adil Najm.
Yes.
Fascinating. And he pointed out that COVID-19 was an existential crisis. If we didn't do something about it, we would all perish. And that was, you could see it, you could feel it. It was in our homes. We were affected by it. And therefore, it questioned my existence, right? The existence of my loved ones. And so we poured money into it. And so that when it comes to climate change, so then I would imagine, well, it's not like we don't have money. We've got the money to put into, to making some sort of change, but we don't because, well, not being really.
But I think let's be kind to us human beings as well. The nature of change that's required here is immense.
Right.
Just on the most superficial level, how many flights did you take in the year before the pandemic hit?
Maybe 3 a year.
3 a year?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll be honest, I have to travel for work, I travel to see family, I travel for my holidays, and I was probably taking 9 or 10 flights a year, right? Business travelers, it could be up to 9 to 15 flights a month, sure. Right?
Yeah.
And if I just suddenly told you, that's it, you can only, there's no commercial air travel anymore. It's for emergency reasons, for family relocation, and that's it. And if you can't get there by train or by bicycle, thank you, but not possible. Huh. Is that something that you'd be willing to take as a change? No. I wouldn't either, right? No. And I think and that's the sort of most sort of anecdotal version of what we can talk about, because when you talk about sort of suddenly cutting down on the use of fossil fuels, we're essentially talking about changing what's available in the supermarket, how often you have electricity, whether or not you can use cooling devices, whether or not and how you travel, what food is available to you in the supermarkets. We're almost going, we would talk in the best case scenario about going back to a time where you're trying to live on food that can be grown in the 15 miles around you. And that's just not a world any of us have experienced or seen or I think can even imagine anymore. So the ask is big. And I think that's why I'm saying we need to find some middle ground between these mega changes that are just absolutely needed and a way to make that story feel a little bit more acceptable, or to have some sort of global consensus on what we are willing to. I'd very happily give up every made in China plastic item in my life, but I probably wouldn't give up a flight to visit my mother. So how do you get the whole world to sit down and find out what that equation is for them and decide where we're happy and where we are willing to change?
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Huma, for joining us on Green Hour.
FM91 presents Green Hour on Khalid Malik's Morning Jam. Watch the episodes on digital platforms of FM91, News 1 and TV 1.